this computer. Okay. Hello, honey viewers, honey listeners. I am really excited to be here today. My name is Diamond Forde. I am the interviews editor for Honey Literary, and I am currently in conversation with Rosa Castellano about her forthcoming debut book, All Is the Telling, right? Which should be dropping on April 5th, but is available for pre-order likely by the time you see this interview, but on February 1st, right? So if you are intrigued by what you hear, you should definitely snag yourself a copy. Rosa, thank you so much for joining me today.
I am so excited to be here. I think being the interviews editor sounds so fun. Like I read through some of the past ones, like you get to meet the best people. I'm like, how do I apply for that job?
It's really just a title that says I'm really dorky. I love talking to other poets about poetry, and this kind of gives me the permission to do that. Yeah, when Dorothy asked me if I wanted to be interviews editor, I said yes because it keeps me accountable to doing the stuff that I like to do, which is be in community with other writers. So I wouldn't change it for anything else.
No, I don't blame you. And you ask the best questions.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Right? Okay, so to kick us off, I'm going to go ahead and ask one of those questions. Okay. So the first question that I had for you, Rosa, is that all of the telling is organized in six sections, once for each thing, and I'm naming the sections for the readers, right? So it's once for each thing, what keeps calling, feathers enough to fly a poem play, and again, just once and never again, with one section, just once, encompassing a single poem. I would argue this is pretty significant in terms of your organizational work for a poetry collection, especially for a first book. Juggling so many distinct segments while still constructing a consistent narrative arc is just one of the ways that you demonstrate your incredible capacity for range in this book, Rosa. Okay. I want to take a moment to ask you to describe what you see as the narrative arc of the book for honey readers who are thinking about picking up their copy. What motivated the choices between your sections? How did you discover the overall shape of your book? And what advice might you have for readers about organizing a manuscript?
Okay. Um, I am excited to talk about this and also slightly embarrassed because the section titles all come from a section of Rilke's Ninth Elegy that was translated by Matthew. I can't remember his last name right now. I should have written it down. But the part that's embarrassing is because I misread it when I first encountered it. And I think that we all bring ourselves to the poems that we read. I believe very, very much that, my collection will be finished by the people who read it. And it allows me a lot of freedom to know that I'm putting this thing out there and that it stops belonging to me once it's read by somebody else. And so I hope that Rilke somewhere doesn't mind that I had the response that I had to his lines, which were, because everything in this world needs us, this whole fleeting world. When I read that, I thought, God damn it. Like,
Oh,
I know everything in this world. I think at the time my children were younger. I have four of them. And the things that I carry, make it hard to be the best version of myself at all times. And the next line was like, which keeps calling to us, the most fleeting of all, which I read as broken, you know. And then he's like, it's once for each thing, just once and never again. And that was so the opposite of true for me. It wasn't once for each thing. I think lots of people who suffer and survive traumas with a big T and traumas with a small t know that things repeat, and sometimes we can lean in and be like, oh, that's an opportunity for healing. Yay. And sometimes it just feels like it's happening again. And so I really wanted to refute this idea that it is just once. And so largely the organizing principle of the book was me sort of working against that idea. Um, and also allowing myself my own reading of that work. And then leaning into the repeat, which is very fun as a poet, I think. In my book, there are maybe 10 or 11 A Girl the Color of poems, and it's a girl the color of a house on fire, a girl
okay.
the color of starlight on water. There's all these different things. Um, and I was able to organize that repeat as part of the overall repeat. There's a lot of returning to childhood. The speakers of those poems are sometimes child or sometimes children, a child version of myself. Those poems, I got advice at the very beginning when I was putting my manuscript together. I went to Under the Volcano, which is this very, very cool residency in Mexico, which if you are not familiar with, it's really cool. They have workshops in Spanish and English. I do not speak Spanish, just for the record, like just to say it's not like easier if you do speak Spanish. It's open to non-Spanish speakers as well, but they do journalism, and they had a poetry manuscript, which a friend sent to me, and it was the first time they were doing it. So nobody else, they weren't sure they were even going to run the class. And it was Keisha Kuipers, who is this fantastic reader of work. She's the editor of Poetry Northwest, and she has a book coming out this spring, and it might be available for pre-order now. I'm not sure, but it's Lonely Women Make Good Lovers, and it just seems really fantastic. I'm super excited. But she had encouraged me to take all the persona poems out. And at first, I was very nervous about doing that. But the Girl the Color of, sorry to jump away and then return back, but those Girl the Color of poems allowed me to have distance for me personally from that speaker, but also to allow those speakers to say things. And in doing that, I think this is kind of a central idea, is dealing with the selves that we carry, allowing all of those things to sort of paper doll out. I'm a big fan of the paper doll as a metaphor for my own personhood. Like I know that sometimes I'm able to meet moments as this sort of version of myself, which I could hope very much that I'm able to stay in this whole time, which is to say this adult, grown up, borderline professional, and not, an anxious or childlike or, whatever. And those parts are valuable. And in this book have voices that contribute to this narrative arc that ends, that begins with storytelling and ends with storytelling. Um, I don't know. I feel like that might be a little bit of a convoluted
No, not at all. I think it was.
answer, but creating a book is a convoluted process.
Mm,
When you organize your poems, you just shuffle them again and you have a different long book length poem. And sometimes that's really fun, and sometimes it's actually quite frustrating. So I guess the advice I would give is to try to find folks who are in the same boat. And I'm going to teach a class this May, I think, and then it's a short, like 4-week stop dreaming and do it, because I think there's a lot of folks, Diamond, you probably know folks who've been writing for a little while, publishing for a couple of years, and they have a book. Like they have a book. Like I know they have a book, they have a book, but they don't know they have a book,
yeah,
Sometimes you don't know you have a book until you start laying those poems out and
yeah.
seeing how they talk to each other. I think looking at other books like Diamond's book for inspiration on laying out your collection, what you do, I love what you do, where you take us from one poem right to the next, and it's really just a long poem together. Like those two poems together make something different than those two poems singularly.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's so much good stuff in that collection.
That book is
For
also, sorry, that book is also in the legacy of what you were talking about like not knowing you have a book until you lay it all out, right? That was another project, right, that I didn't know I had a book in the works until I was able to lay it all out. So I appreciate you kind of seeing those connections and the way that it builds on itself that way, and also kind of creating space to recognize that for other folks too. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, well, and that's all it is. I'm
Mm.
obviously not an expert. I only have one book. It's not even out yet, like whatever. But it is really just about making space. No one wants to have conversations about epigrams. Like, what do you feel about epigrams? What do you think? Do you think they work? Do I use epigrams more than once in every section? No, people don't want to talk about that who are not working on a book. And so you need space and the opportunity to be in community with folks who are wrestling with some of the same questions. And that's really all I'm trying to do, especially in that 4-week one. And then in the long one, we'll read whole manuscripts in the fall. But yeah, I'm kind of excited and curious to see what people show up with and then what they end up with, because that's always fun.
The beautiful path, and it sounds like it's going to be an incredible course, Rosa. I thank you so much for sharing that. And I would even say, if I can wax poetic, that I think the misreading was kind of a sort of divinity, right? That it was exactly the kind of, you read exactly what you needed to read for this book to happen, right? And I never think that that would be a misreading at all.
Thank you for that.
For the second question that I have for you, right, as readers might have no doubt guessed from the fact that I listed the sections, right, time is an important organizational and thematic force within this book. And I found myself startled and delighted by the book's resistance to, and maybe that's not the right word, its insistence on the simultaneity of time that feels closer, more in line with the agency and urgency of the book, especially in poems like the book's opener, Survival is Plural, which I will quote in just a moment, and how often the simultaneity of time is played into, on, and through racialized embodiment. I am, of course, talking about the dichotomous dynamic of past and present, but also, most importantly, talking about the presences of both the Black child and the Black adult throughout the book, two seemingly distinct markers of time and experience. And yet, for the Black child, the process of racialization is also adultification, right? Or the rendering of the child's body through sight, association, and treatment as grown. See, for instance, the description of the 6-year-old in the aforementioned poem, and I'm going to quote the poem here, right? Quote, her shoulders, the width of a man's hand, wing as she walks a hallway past those who don't see love laid in the neat lines of her braids. End quote. Incredible, powerful, disturbing, unsettling, right? And of course, that dynamic plays vice versa in this book too, shows that the Black adult can and is too often rendered perpetually infantile, right? Take this moment in On Survival, or Hey Kitten Still Hanging in There, which is such a great title, by the way, right? Which reminds us that violence necessary for the process of racialization can collapse the here and now, can collapse within the adult speaker the rememory of her child father, quote, because the emptiness in my body is person shaped and passed down from ancestor to ancestor, each having shared beds with the bodies of their dead. My father, too, his child sized body tucked beside his grandmother's unbreathing form all night. Again, you really have a great job, or do a great job in this book, of capturing these kind of startling moments of kind of complicated humanity, right? But with kind of such profound beauty and concision. I'm hoping, Rosa, that you can speak more about the relationship time has in this book for you. What do you think is the relationship between time and Black embodiment? What might change in our understanding around time if we look at that connection?
That's such a really good question. And I love your word simultaneity. I can't even say
We'll
it.
just say
But
simultaneous.
okay. But no, but I love it because it's what you're doing with that word is pushing the nature of simultaneousness to encompass a self-awareness of being in time in more than one way, perhaps is the way to say it. You said collapsing the here and now. I think all of us have experienced those moments where our now is collapsed by our dysregulation, by a memory, by touch sometimes is enough to do it, right? And we exist in this state in part because of epigenetics, part because this Black body carries stuff, it's carrying a lot. All Black bodies are at, I want to say simultaneously, both carrying, in the act of carrying, while potentially not wanting to speak for others, longing to put some of the things down. We're carrying things that belong to us generationally. And that's an interesting idea. Like what do we do with the things that belong to us, that come down to us through generational lines? That's not a thing you just set down casually, even if it's in fact a terrible thing. That more than anything you want to set it down. I'm just saying I think it's complicated. I think in general it is complicated to be a person. But Christina Sharp's book In the Wake, she talks about arrivals and departures as being, sort of this overlapping all the time. And again, that overlapping of self. So for me, time, which I love that you pulled this out, by the way, time is in that collapsed moment. And I have no I have no science talk. Like I have no science talk at all. Like I I wish that I did, because I think there is like some, if we had like a third person who was like a physicist or something, could make some connections between the way that real time operates, you know? Because I think there's truth in what we feel. Like we know that. Like, you know, your therapist or my therapist might say feelings aren't facts, and that is true. But what's also true is that I have chills on my arms,
Mhm.
or that I cannot stop my heart from this rapid beating, or that my eyes are literally filling with tears, right? Like we are containing these things simultaneously while we're existing. And I know, again, that's being a person. And yet it's complicated and difficult and challenging and beautiful and wonderful. And I think if we can own that time, that presence, like being present, isn't just putting my feet on the floor. Like I wish it was. Like I would hold on, let me be present. Do you know what I'm trying to say? That you can't just I can't, and I know that, like, yes, put your feet on the floor. There's value, lots of value, and I will put my feet on the floor. They're not right now,
Mhm.
but it's not a simple thing to be a person in time. And you're like, duh. That's how I feel about the characters in this book, the real people in this book, myself in this book. That I'm living in my own layers while I'm writing these poems. And I think that's important. I think for BIPOC folks in particular, for survivors of trauma in particular, or for people who are in relationship, which is everybody, with those folks, to understand how time is working and enacting on this body in this moment, and to make a little space, because being present sometimes invites the question, which present, you know?
That's incredible. Oh my God. It was such astutness too, and thinking about not just how the body is kind of affected by time, but how the body even expresses time, right? Some of the ways that the body, like literally time exists simultaneously in the small and minute actions of the body. Incredible, incredible, thoughtful, and the kind of thoughtfulness that exists already within the book, right? You crafted it with so much care, Rosa. Thank you for that. Right. I want to think for a moment about the symbology of wings here, which plays a metaphor throughout the book in key moments where the speaker or subject hopes to escape. The wings then become the impetus for that fleeing, even if the impetus is just a wish. And though it also reminds us about the necessity and legacy of travel, this book traverses quite a few spaces throughout the American South, which is really impressive. Maryland, Florida, the swamps and cities of Georgia, just to name a few. And while some of the landscapes might ring familiar, so that we might know, and I'm going to quote a section, a incredible section from the poem I'm Not Where I'm Supposed to Be, Okefenokee Swamp, Georgia, 1882, quote, a place belonging more to cotton mouths than to cotton root, and to the swamp song winging over the water. Just, I wish I wrote that, right? We are also consistently reminded that the Black subject can either be made wholly unfamiliar to these spaces, or worse, made so familiar that these landscapes speak always the painful song of our history. Quote, speak the language of lynching, a language taught to the trees, which is another poem from the book. It is impossible to know where we are supposed to be in the United States, how the world, and yet this book responds to that impossibility by placing the Black subject in so many anywheres. In light of all that I've said, can you tell me a little more about the importance of place, and in particular the American South, to all of the telling? And how did you include or how did you know which places to include and explore within the book? And are there other places that you think the book travels that I haven't mentioned yet?
Um, I think for me and for what I was attempting to do in the collection, whether, you know, whatever, um, it has a lot to do with belonging. So the title, All is the Telling, is supposed to speak to, or at least for me, like an umbrella that I'm using is this idea of story, the stories
Mhm.
we carry, the stories that tell us who we are, and home um, is almost an embodiment of those stories, you know, like, oh, that doorknob, I remember oh, that, you know, like you can look at any place in the space that is the place that is most your home, the place that feels the most like home, and sometimes that's your childhood home or not. And so I'm from Florida, and even though I haven't lived there because I've been a grown up for a really long time, um, I'm bad at math, so I can't actually tell you how long it's been. I'm just
No
trying to
math here.
figure it out. I can't figure it out, but I carry those spaces with me. I lived in Vermont for like 9 years, and there's only one poem, which I wasn't really writing so much then either, because I had like 4 kids in like 5.5 years or something, and so like all of this just, but also like, oh, so wonderful, but also like I couldn't,
Mhm.
I'm not, that wasn't a space for writing for me. Anyways, and so half of that was in Vermont, but I don't have Vermont poems, is the point that I'm trying to make. Vermont never felt like home to me for lots of reasons, and some of which have nothing to do, that aren't bad at all. It's a beautiful place. But Florida is a place that I carry inside, and the Georgia in this poem is on the border, and it's very similar. And um, well, and Florida as part of the South is a special place too.
Mhm.
Um, the way that it's geographically, it's different than the other parts of the South.
Mhm.
Historically, in terms of how slavery operated,
Mhm.
is very different there. And not better or worse or anything. It's just different. And it feels different in lots of ways. So I wanted Florida to be part of this collection, like, because it is part of me. And so there's oranges everywhere, and palm trees, and sunsets, and like modern kinds of considerations, like bake ziti at a beach. Who does that? My family. Freaking hot, anyways. But also, the historical Florida, which Florida is one of those places that still has, or at least it feels like it has a wildness to it. If you drive through New England and you look at the wild trees growing alongside the highway, those have been cut and planted and cut and planted so many times that the wildness is no longer there. And while in Florida, hurricanes knock them down, and then they just overgrow themselves. There is still a wildness in that landscape. And a dangerousness in that landscape. I think lots of folks who write about Florida cannot escape that there is a danger in the landscape. And I think a lot of writers of color can't escape the danger in the landscape. And it's not just because of Florida, but Florida, it's different. It's just different. And so I definitely wanted that feeling for the book. The poem play, those girls in the poem play do follow a little bit the path of migration. And um, there is something about that migration that belongs to all of us in different ways, that we've inherited from our relatives and ancestors who either didn't migrate or did migrate, and what that means for our individual families and selves. And I think I wanted to point a little bit to migration as an individual moment, like not what it costs, but what it gives us, the gift of it. I know for me, um, I forget sometimes because it's actually, there are parts of that story that aren't really great, that are in fact, folks hoping for something and ending up in, situations that are worse in some ways, that opportunities aren't where they're supposed to be. And I don't want to, we all know what I'm talking about, I think. But there is still this sense that if migration hadn't happened, Denzel Washington would never have been an actor. And I don't know him personally. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like, why, but I do know that opportunity, because we have Blackness in all these new spaces, that things are changing and things happen. And so, anyways, I just wanted to nod not to the big story, but to the small story, a little bit in that poem play section. Uh, Even though she's passing and it's a whole complicated situation on its own. And the value of staying, like there's two sisters, and one passes for white and the other stays. And the choices that they make, and one ends up staying, on the edge of the Okefenokee swamp, and all that sort of implies, that sort of earthiness and grounding, but also like swamps are not really the best places either, like,
Mhm.
anyways.
No, I love that. I love the way that those threads kind of came together in your response as well. Kind of thinking about all that we've been talking about already with time and place. And when you said like Florida is kind of like home that lives in your heart, right? Feels like that within the book that we are simultaneously tying the idea of time, even though Florida is a part of your past, right? It is still very much present within you, right? Thinking about home being a thing that we hold within us, thinking about, again, that embodiment and its kind of attachment and tied to all of these things, especially racialized embodiment, right? All of that
Mhm.
feels beautifully kind of tied together. And you were talking a little bit about your poem plays, and I kind of want to go ahead and shift and talk about that a little bit as someone who is a fat poet and therefore deeply invested in malleability of genre, thinking about what that means. I like how much the poem play at once kind of harkens to other contemporary writers who are also kind of dabbling in the same kind of playground. I was thinking immediately of Aria D. Matthews and Simulacra. Anastasia Renee, who I interviewed recently, also did some of this work in her works too. And I love the poem play in particular because of the themes that it opens up, especially in connection to the title of the book, which I'm so glad that you kind of talked a little bit about what all is the telling means, right? And I think that the connection between them asks us to pay attention to the complexities, necessities, and intricacies of narrative, right? Both in the book and outside of it, that it's just as important who tells the story, but also how they tell it. Um, do you want to talk about the poem play a little bit more, who it stars? You kind of talked a little bit about the kind of two central characters and this sort of the navigation of passing that kind of happens within their story. But what also why you felt like the poem play was a necessary addition to All Is the Telling.
Yeah. I just I wanted to ground the book in historical context,
Yeah.
both in terms of the journey that I'm personally on as being one that's, doesn't just belong to me, but also in terms of the stories that we carry inside our bodies, whether we have knowledge of carrying them or not, but also when we do have knowledge, what it means to belong to a legacy of passing, what it means to belong to a legacy of estrangement, what it means when we live in a community where historically love is something that's dangerous. And so I wanted a space to unpack those feelings and thoughts, um, and to give voice to these. They are imagined characters, but for me, they bring to life very real and like moments. There's a lot of poems in the book that are also, about my family. There's moms and dads and brothers and sisters that show up, and I'm bringing this up to say, not every single poem is true. Like
Yeah.
is containing a true story, but the feeling inside that poem is 100% true.
Hmm.
And that's how I feel about the two sisters in this poem and their story. And to your point, I do think I think you're right. I mean, obviously, yes, it matters, who's telling the story, but with the play, even though it's on the page, there's an invitation to visualize these speakers in their bodies, and what that might look like. I visualize it as a very, plain stage, just the single speaker, which is why there are no stage directions, like in terms of like, I tried it, it didn't work, it didn't work. Like he's hanging up laundry. Like I am actually not a playwright at this time. So it felt very like clunky and intrusive because what was really important is just centering the story that each character that comes on stage, it's just the two sisters, want to tell this thing that they can't tell anybody else because they're no longer in contact with each other. Um, and so, yeah, I think the play, as opposed to just a poem, invites readers to really see the speakers. And I, again, love that when you read a poem, or in this case, you're seeing a play in your head, but you get to pick. You get to pick what they look like. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that. And I think the poems work on their own, just for the record. But I love that you get to bring, as a reader, your mom to this poem, or your grandma to this poem, or your sister to this poem, or that lady at church whose voice sounds like this speaker's voice. I love that. I think it's important because that's how the story is supposed to work. It's not just supposed to belong to me. At least that's my hope, you know. And I think the play allows for that a little bit.
Well, Rosa, you may not be a playwright right now, but you will be when this book drops, right? Thank you so much for sharing your time with me. I only have one last question, right? It's a kind of common question that I end these interviews with, right? What are you working on now? What's next? What projects are occupying your space, if any, right? What's on your brain these days?
So the last poem in my collection, oh, well, it's my real last poem. The actual last poem is really just a hug. Like it's really, like it really is. It's a hug for myself. It's a hug for you. Thank you for reading this book. We're all gonna be okay, you know. But the second to the last poem makes use of Janice Smith's like super awesome poem. I'm going back to Minnesota where sadness makes sense. And so the title is I'm going back to my childhood where yelling makes sense.
Mhm.
And then there's poem, and then it's kind of haunted by this, like all the girls, the colors of who show up in the book. She kind of haunts this last poem and says, "Tell me a story. I don't care if it's true." And so those two things are sort of sitting with me in different ways. One has to do a little bit with the fact that I'm now parenting teens and I would like to go back to my childhood where yelling is allowed, you know.
Yeah.
But also, what does that mean? Like really unpacking. It's a lot about me a little bit as a mother and what I want for my kids and for this world. Um, and then tell me a story. I don't care if it's true. I'm very interested in I don't know, like the fiction. And maybe it's part of where we are in the world, you know, like what are the stories that we need to make the world that we want, you know? And so it's not true yet. It's not really, I don't really want to write a novel. Like that's not really it. But I am curious about, you know, like what like the blank space as a container to hold our imaginings for this world that I think we all sort of want, but looks different, you know? And I'm sort of curious about like what that means and what that could look like. And a little bit, maybe some collaboration. Like I'm just sort of in this space. And I am finally writing again things that don't go in this book, but I feel like that started last week. like it's been a journey to get here. But I am excited to keep going for sure. And before you like are like, oh, and thank you for coming, I have to ask you an important question. Like
Yes, please
it's
do.
really only important to me.
Hit me.
But I don't know if people who watch this know that you are like they probably know that you're an excellent writer and hopefully they have read your book, but you're also an excellent reader of your work and are fun. Like just it's fun, even though your work is hard and like you know we feel it. It's also wonderful to be in your readings and I got to hear you read a couple of years ago when you came to my town, and you did your Jolene. You did the poem where you invite the audience to sing the chorus to Jolene, and I don't know which poem it is, and I really want to know, so that I can do it in my head while I'm reading it.
So that one is actually not in Mother Body and even my forthcoming book, it's not in that one. It was in that one, and then I ended up having to pull it out. So the only place that you can find it right now is in the Let Me Say This anthology,
That's
which
cool.
is a Dolly Parton anthology, a kind of collection of poems around Dolly Parton.
That's really
But I am hopeful that that will appear someday in some collection, maybe even the work that I'm doing now around Outcast. But thank you so much for remembering that reading.
it
I'm
was
really excited.
fantastic. The whole audience just leaned right in,
Thank
which is
you.
what we want. You know, it was
Yeah,
fantastic.
thank you.
When is your collection coming out? Do we have a date yet?
Yeah, so we don't have an exact date, but we do have the year. It will officially be coming out in spring of 2026,
Okay.
with Scribner
Oh,
Books.
that's exciting. You
Thank
know, I
you.
run a poetry festival, right? In spring of 20, like it's in April. So maybe That
Lovely.
will be something cool to happen. You're only in Tennessee, right?
I'm
That
in Asheville, North Carolina right now.
Oh, that's even closer.
Mhm.
Okay. Interesting.
I love it. Thank you, Rosa.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your questions. They
Mhm.
were so good and so fun to think about.
Mhm.
I read them out loud to like all of my children, like separately. Like, hey, come see what you come, what do you, like
I
I just
love
really
that. They're going to be really excited to see this interview as well, I'm sure,
their
so they can see
teams.
your brilliant shine too, right? Thank you for sharing your love, your light, and the passion of your work with us. Honey, listeners, you need the copy of All Is the Telling. I promise you, you will not regret it. It is an incredible debut. Few debuts are as incredibly talented as Rosa's is. So please, please do yourself a favor and secure that copy. Thank you for joining us, Rosa.
Thank you for having me.
All right, honey, be well.